as Joe said, the subject of my talk is the children born in Britain during the war to black GIs. So what drew me to this research? Well, this appears to be a history that's really very little known. I mean, histories of the British experience of the Second World War are extensive, but they rarely feature these babies, these war babies. Further, although everyone knows that about the arrival of the ship, the Empire Windrush in 1948, it's generally assumed to be the starting point for the growth of a post-war black British population. But about 2,000 mixed-race GI babies were born in Britain a few years prior to the Windrush's arrival. Now, this might not sound a large number, but if we take into account that the pre-war black British population was an estimated 8,000 only, extraordinary. These children represented a not insignificant 25% increase in numbers of people of colour over a couple of years. And another reason I was drawn to this, the study of these wartime babies, is more personal, because interracial relationships and mixed raceness are there in my own family, which is a kind of enriching diversity that may possibly be typical of many 21st century families. Now, I want to open my talk with a short video made in England by CNN that some of you might have seen. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's only 4 minutes. I think it's worth a second look, so let's hope it works. Okay, so I was filmed for that as well because I set this thing up. Luckily, they cut me out. But those 4 cover the spectrum of experiences of many of the children that I interviewed. I didn't interview all of them for my recent book. And I suggested these 4 people to CNN for precisely that reason. So what do I mean by spectrum? Well, someone who's kept by his mother, as in the case of Dave Greene, someone who's given up to a children's home and is adopted, as in the case of Deborah Pryor, and she sounds Australian because she then in the 70s went to live in Australia. Someone who's given up but never adopted, as in the case of Carol Edwards, and then someone who's adopted by his father, as in the case of Leon. And here he is arriving in the States, age 3, and he's the most lovely person. In fact, it was very hard for these fathers to adopt their children. It was blocked by the British government, ostensibly because it was against the British Adoption Act of 1939, which stipulated that children could only be adopted by British subjects or by relatives, and as putative fathers only, because DNA testing didn't come in until at least the 60s. The fathers were not deemed relatives. But there was one year, 1948, when some African Americans, including fathers, were permitted by the British to adopt these children, but then it was blocked again, despite hundreds of African Americans actually coming forward really keen to adopt them. And the reason, I believe, was because the British government didn't want to be beholden to the Americans any more than it was already. It appears that through 1948, it became increasingly concerned about being seen as shirking responsibility of dumping the mixed-race children of British subjects, because they are British subjects by virtue of being born in Britain to British mothers, dumping them onto the Americans. And that's a term, I've looked at all this correspondence, the National Archives, that was the term that was used, this kind of fear that there had been. You know, there was deep ambivalence about the special relationship. There was also deep ambivalence about the mere presence of black GIs in Britain. And the British government didn't want them to come. In August 1942, the British War Cabinet asserted that, quote, it was justified in pressing the United States authorities to reduce as far as possible the number of coloured troops, coloured, of course, the term used then, sent to this country. And the following month, the Secretary for State for War, James Grigg, presented the reasons for this position in his memorandum, which was called United States Coloured Troops in the United Kingdom. Now, what's amazing, can you see? It says to be kept under lock and key, emblazoned in red at the top. Such was the desired secrecy. And it's great when when you are a researcher and you find these things. Have only been released quite recently and kept under lock, no one's meant to see it. And there I am reading this. It's very thrilling. And why it was so secret? Because it's very overtly racist. So to quote from it, the average white American soldier does not understand the normal British attitude to the colour problem, and his respect for this country may suffer if he sees British troops and the population generally drawing no distinction between white and coloured. This difference of attitude might clearly give rise to friction Moreover, the coloured troops themselves probably expect to be treated in this country as in the United States, and a markedly different treatment might well cause political difficulties in America at the end of the war. And indeed, it really did fuel the civil rights movement when they came back from the war. Finally, from the point of view of the morale of our own troops, it is most undesirable that there should be any unnecessary association between American coloured troops and British women. And attached to this memo was a paper headed Notes on Relations with Coloured Troops, written by a Major General who was in charge of the Southern Command, where a large population of black GIs were stationed, large proportion of it. And this is a very explicitly racist article, which was ratified by the War Office, and he asserts white women should not associate it, and it's in italics, with coloured men. It follows then that they should not walk out, dance or drink with them. But actually dancing and drinking, particularly at dances labelled black dances or at segregated pubs, were where local women met black GIs, because the Americans brought their segregation policies with them. The army stayed segregated in 1948, and they designated certain pubs black pubs, others white, and there were black dances one night, white the next. So this was to kind of reduce the tension between whites and blacks, because white GIs, if they saw black GIs with white British women, they generally were incredibly angry, and they actually would, beat up the black. There were a lot of really terrible reactions and killings over these issues. So the British government may not have wanted black GIs to come to Britain, but come they did. The exact number isn't known. President Roosevelt had pledged to black American leaders that 10% of the wartime troops would be African American. However, those who came to Britain, the figure was probably nearer 8%. Now, you may not know how many GIs came. I mean, GI is the general term used for American servicemen. How many came? But actually, it's meant to be 3 million American troops passed through Britain, obviously not at any one time, but passed through Britain in the period 42 to 45, which gives for black GIs a figure in the region of 240,000, although never that number at any one time. On arrival, the general public generally greeted the black GIs with enthusiasm, and reports from the Home Intelligence Unit had been set up in November 1939 to monitor British morale. It frequently mentions, as they put it, people's appreciation of the extremely pleasing manner of the coloured troops. And here are some of them marching in London and in Somerset. Writer George Orwell, as he's expressed it, quote, "The general consensus of opinion appears to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the Negroes." And there's meant to be a West Country farmer who said, "I love the Americans, but I don't like those white ones they brought with them." Now, white GIs, in contrast, were often thought brash and boastful, although, of course, all GIs were commended for their generosity, and they earned 5 times more than the British Tommy, and they handed out what was called the 4 C's. So cigarettes, candy, their word for chocolate, chewing gum, and Coca-Cola, and indeed nylons, stockings, which for women suffering rationing was a huge treat. Women were having to resort to staining their legs with gravy powder and getting someone to do a black line up the back, because that's what stockings were like. And I've recently been to Atlanta and been to the Coca-Cola Museum, and I sort of realised, actually, this is probably the first time anyone in Britain had come across Coca-Cola. So the Britons emphasised their racial tolerance in contrast to the Americans. As the African-American journalist Roy Otley observed, the average Englishman, as I came to know him, relishes the luxury of denouncing racial prejudice in America. Often he is snootily superior about the Americans' inability to solve the Negro problem. But to Otley, quote, "British racial prejudice is often more subtle than prejudice in the US. He had visited Britain during the war, and he had registered attitudes firsthand. But British prejudice was not so subtle when it claimed to black servicemen forming relationships with local women." To Otley, quote, "Notwithstanding the widespread Negro associations with white women in the British Isles and a public tolerance seemingly, Englishmen have a deeply ingrained horror of such relations." He called it England's racial double talk. For although Britons stressed their tolerance, they didn't necessarily condone intimacy, indeed were often hostile to interracial sex and marriage. So if the British government didn't want black GIs to fraternise with British women, neither did many of the public. Certainly not the older generation of women, or indeed any British men. As historian Wendy Webster refers to it, you could be friendly, polite and welcoming. She calls it friendly but brief, but they drew the line at sexual relations. If women in relationships with black GIs went on to have a child, they faced a barrage of criticism. By October 1943, the Home Intelligence Unit was noting people's rising concern about the growing number of illegitimate babies, many of coloured men. The children born to black GIs and British women in the war were nearly all illegitimate. Now, of course, that would have been the case where the mother or father was already married to someone else. But even where couples were single and wanted to marry, their children were born out of wedlock. Every American serviceman had to receive permission to marry from his commanding officer, who in Britain were virtually all white, and avoidance of this permission was in fact a court-martialed offence. But for a black GI wanting to marry a white British woman, permission was invariably refused. According to black former GI Almost Davenport, writing after the war, the US Army, quote, unofficially had a gentleman's agreement which became in practice official policy. The agreement said no Negro soldier or sailor will be given permission to marry any British white girl. Not one GI bride going back to the US under the US government scheme is the wife of a Negro. Now, only a few of them have got children, but they're all in that picture, but they're all kind of white children. And the rationale they would give was that back in the States, there were then 48 states, 30 had anti-miscegenation laws that forbade marriage between whites and blacks. As historian Brenda Gale Plumer suggests, US military authorities had considerable difficulty in recognising the capacity and right of the African American men under their control to father. They saw to the American authorities, responsible fatherhood indicated civic entitlement and respectability. There's a distinction between fathering, as a free man would, and siring, as done by a slave or an animal. So they couldn't or wouldn't see a black serviceman as truly free men, and as with slaves, they denied legitimate black paternity. Now, presumably babies born to white GIs would on occasion have been passed off as the offspring of husbands if the dates roughly fitted. They'd come back on leave and whatever. This initially was the case with one of my interviewees, Babs, and I think you heard her on the radio. Now, she was born in October 1944, and her mother was married. Her husband was, quote, in the Navy, and when he came back from being at sea, he honestly believed I was his child. I think because my complexion at the time was very fair. It took 6 months for my complexion to change. She was then packed off to a Dr. Bernardo's home in Suffolk. In 1945, a baby on the hospital ward of a nurse Johnson in West Bromwich was noticeably brown-skinned from birth, writing a diary for Mass Observation. Mass Observation, you might know, was a British social research organisation that had been set up in 1937 to kind of record everyday life through volunteers writing diaries and putting out questionnaires. Anyway, Johnson records that the baby, quote, had been getting darker complexioned each day. The mother had been getting very worried about it, and today she became hysterical and said its father was a black American soldier. The husband had been looking at the baby very intently during the last day or two, and it was decided the best thing to do was tell him the truth. The mother went home with her husband, but without the baby. The black American fathers, the white British mothers, and the children born of the relationships were all regularly treated with contempt. Some of the men were accused of rape, accusations which may very well have been false. In July 1944, for example, the Crisis. Now, the Crisis was the paper of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, which is an organisation that still exists. It reported, quote, a white Southern lieutenant in a Negro anti-aircraft company who just couldn't stand to see his men enjoying the courtesies extended by the white women of a certain eastern town. I think it's Ipswich. He posted a notice that any type of association with white women is regarded as rape, and reminded his men the penalty for rape during wartime is death. And to explain that, the Americans, when they came, were allowed to bring their own laws. They were not under British jurisdiction. And indeed, the penalty for rape was life imprisonment or rape, or life imprisonment is death, the death penalty. And in fact, of in Shepton Mallet, they took over this nice little place, Shepton Mallet in Somerset, and set up a gallows. And of those that were hanged for rape, they were all black GIs. And I think the white men accused of rape just got life imprisonment. Thus, any relationship between a black GI and a white British woman could have been construed as rape. The justification that has usually been given for lynchings, of course, as you know, in the American South. Joe, who was put in a children's home, found out later that his maternal grandparents had identified his black GI father as a commanding officer. But when his father said he wished to keep his newborn child, he was told that if he maintained a relationship with the mother, he would be charged with rape. And I've heard of other cases like that. The mothers of children born to black GIs were also often treated badly. A number of their children mentioning the hostility and stigmas their mother faced and the taunts. Monica Roberts' mother was often called names in the street. Quote, I remember one time there was a lady from a couple of doors away. Her and Mum never got on. I remember one day Mum and me were sat on the gate where we lived and this lady came past and hit Mum and shouted abuse in the street. Terry Harrison recalls that some people, quote, would bang on their metal dustbins whenever my mum walked by. It became a daily ritual for people to cross the road to avoid my mother rather than speak to her. When Carol B was born in December 1944 to a white mother and a black American serviceman, her mother was disowned by her family. Her mother was 21, single, living in Birkenhead, near Liverpool, and was in the army. Carol B remembers, my mum's family, they just shunned her. It was horrible. I can remember walking down the street with her and she said hello to them and they just ignored her. Henry's memory of his mother being spat at for having a black child was probably not uncommon. Despite all this abuse, over half the babies were kept by mothers or grandmothers, often in the face of extreme opposition and no financial aid. The children also had a difficult time. In the 30s and 40s, Britain was very largely a white country. Numbers of black people rose greatly during the war, not only because of the presence of black GIs, but also because of West Indians coming to contribute to the war effort as service personnel, especially in the RAF, and as munition workers. But nevertheless, soon after the war, numbers shrank again for the next few years. And although never back to the pre-war number, most areas remained white, particularly the sites where the GIs had been largely based and where the children grew up. So South and Southwest England, South Wales, East Anglia, where all the air bases were, the Midlands and Lancashire. The children had little or no black or mixed race role models. Most suffered racism, the stigma of illegitimacy and a confused identity. Monica, who grew up in Wiston on the outskirts of Liverpool, remembers, no other mixed-race brown kids in my area at all. That was the hardest bit. People literally would turn round if I walked into a shop and stare. It was horrible. It made me feel like a complete outcast, like I was contaminated. Jennifer Brown, born in Leicester, recalls one particular incident. There was a girl that was very friendly. She told me where she lived, and I called on her one night, and her mother opened the door. Oh, she went bananas. She went mad. I thought she was going to have the door off the hinges. Good thing my fingers weren't in the door. She'd have broken them. Racist name-calling was widespread for these children. For example, in addition to Blackie and the N-word, when Gillian Loder got to secondary modern school, they used to call her Gillywog. So Deborah Pryor, you saw her on the programme, the thing I never got used to was being pointed at in shops. Mummy, why is that girl black? She found the hardest thing was not knowing why I was different. If you've got an identity that includes being black, you should be proud of it. So Deborah is the third on the left, and Carol is the second, you saw on the programme, is the second on the left with the big hair. And I've also interviewed Anne in the front and the family of Leon at the back. There is a long and ugly history of hostility, not only towards interracial relationships, but also towards the so-called half-caste, which of course was a term used in Britain at the time. My book is called Brown Babies because that was a term used by the African-American press, which is clearly preferable to half-caste. In 1937, a polemic entitled Half-Caste by a self-defined Eurasian, someone called Cedric Dover, while claiming the richness of hybrid potentiality, also indicated the extent of prejudice facing those of mixed race. To quote, the half-caste appears in a prodigal literature. It presents him mostly as an undersized, scheming, and entirely degenerate bastard. His father is a blackguard, his mother a whore. But more than that, more than all that, he's a potential menace to Western civilization, to everything that is white and sacred. So what he's suggesting is that the existence of the so-called half-caste represented a challenge to national and racial boundaries, to the neat polarity between the white British and the non-white colonised racial other. Visiting African-American anthropologist John Sinclair Drake, and he'd come over to do his PhD actually on race relations in Britain in 1947, and he was aware of how such children could not be hidden away. The high visibility of the coloured illegitimate child made him so conspicuous that the onlooker could never forget what he symbolised. And what he or she symbolised was that the black GIs had indeed lived up to the last two attributes of how all the GIs were caricatured, being overpaid, overfed, oversexed and over here. I'm sure you've heard that. And their response, do you know their response? That Brits were underpaid, underfed, undersexed and under Eisenhower, because of course Eisenhower was in command of the European theatre of war. The children were taunted for being illegitimate. I think it's hard for us today to appreciate how being illegitimate was a real stigma. So they were taunted for that, for being black and being different, including being a Yanks child. Monica remembers, quote, having a row with a girl in the street when I was about 13, she said to me, "You should go home, you're not one of us, you're a Yanks kid." Monica didn't know what that meant, indeed didn't know at this stage that she had an American father. She was not atypical in not knowing about her father. Whether or not they grew up in children's homes, nearly all my interviewees knew little or nothing about their fathers. They often did not even know their father's name. Over the years, some had found their fathers. When he was young, James Andrews asked his mother about his father, but, quote, and now he's someone who was in a children's home until he was 8, and his mother then managed to get him back. But my mother always said I was not to ask questions in front of Reg, my stepfather, because it wouldn't be fair, it'd be rude to do so, so I didn't ask any more questions. His mother asked him not to look for his birth father until Reg had died. Reg died in 1985, and sometime later, James's daughter galvanised him into searching for his father. He got his original birth certificate and found his father had registered him, so his army number was included. So in about 2000, with the help of an organisation called GI Trace, which is a self-help group that helps people trace their GI relatives, James found his father. That first moment when James talked to his father on the telephone, quote, it was such a relief. Up to that point, I never felt whole. There was a part of me missing, and finding my dad, that was that part. I felt whole. I felt better and settled. Every member of his family all knew about me. He never kept it a secret. He produced a photograph, which he carried around with him in his wallet all that time, all those years, and he hoped that one day I would try and find him. There was a lot of things to say. It was difficult, because we were both so choked up. My mum said that my dad cried. That's my American mum, that is his stepmother. I call her mum. He cried a lot. So there he is with them. Dave Greene, who you saw in that programme, was unusual in that he was always told about his father by his mother. His mother used to show me photographs. This is your dad. She loved him with a passion. So just to remind you about Dave Greene. My birth certificate was sent to the States in 1949 at his request so that he could sign it, and he also swore an affidavit saying that I am his son. So he acknowledged me, and I believe he wanted to come and take my mum back, but I found out afterwards from a neighbour that my mum didn't get all the letters that were sent. It was very probably his grandmother who intervened and took the letters. Quote, I think it was in order to protect her from being a white person married to a black person in the States. In 1949, his mother married a lovely Scottish man who became, in effect, Dave's father, but he didn't forget his American dad. Years later, in 1999, Dave's friend Chris, a Mormon, offered to help find Dave's father. Now, the Mormons, you may know this, own the world's largest genealogical database, which is run by a non-profit company called Family Search. Why do they do that? Because the church's founder in the 19th century, Joseph Smith, preached the need for the church members to offer baptism to all their ancestors, hence the need to trace their lineages. Now, via access to this database, quote, Chris had given me this list of possibles with the name Greene, it's with an E at the end, in different parts of the States. And I phoned this guy, and I had in my mind that my father's name was David Otis Greene. Mum always thought his middle name was Otis. I get this list of names. I think, okay, I'm going to go through. I phoned a couple. Do you mind? Is your is your husband African American? No, he's white, and so on. Then I spoke to this guy, said, I'm calling from England. I'm trying to locate David Otis Greene. My name is David Otto Greene. Very angry voice, and he was really stroppy about it. He came on really stroppy, quite a refined voice. I thought, crikey, I had a vision of a Germanic person on the other end of the phone getting quite stroppy. I said, sorry to have troubled you. Dave got a bit more information about where his father was likely to be living, and a few months later, he rang this number again. The guy lives in Brooklyn, New York. Phone rings. He picks up. The news is on. Don't you know the news is on? Yeah, but I'm phoning from England. I'm looking for David Otis Greene. He said, I'm David Otto Greene. I said, well, I'm phoning from Yeovil in Somerset. Were you there during the war? He said, well, yeah, I was. Do you know Joan Bagwell, sorry. Yeah, I do. That's my mum. You're my dad. 2.5 hours later, they were still chatting, and then Dave flew out to the US. Being able to meet his father, who was alike in many ways, was life-changing for Dave. Now, Monica's mother was very evasive when asked about Monica's father, saying that he had died in the war. However, she did eventually tell Monica his name. She said his name was Mac. I said, that's a strange name. She said, well, that's his name, that's all I know. And I asked where he was from. She said, I don't know, he lives in America. Monica finally learnt from her mother that her father's full name was Paris Mac, and that, quote, he drove a truck between Liverpool docks and the many US bases around the northwest of England. I used to spend hours daydreaming. I wondered where he was. I wondered if he's alive. I wondered what he looked like, what he does. Has he got married? Has he got a family? With a permanent sadness, all I knew, he was Paris Mac and he lived in America. I got to 58. I thought about Dad occasionally, but hadn't done anything. Now that year, 2002, her son showed her how to use a computer. He said, well, give me the name of something you want information on. I said my dad's name, Paris Mac. He knew the GI story and all the background, but it was nothing we talked about anymore. It had been so long. Well, he put it in. He said, look, Mum, found him. I said, oh, yeah. He said, no, come and have a look. And I walked over and looked at the computer screen, and there was like a sort of official form. It was a Social Security death index. He died in 1994, 8 years previously. Don't touch it. I had that moment then, I don't know, like the breath had left my body. He said, I won't touch it, it won't go away, I can get it back. There was a military number. I wrote to the National Personnel Records Centre in St. Louis. Just over a week, I got a reply back. Her father had had 2 sisters that were older than him, who were still living alive in their 80s, a Lola and Edna, no wife's name, and there was no children at his funeral. So I rang one night. I kept putting it off. The girl in the library in Indiana had given me the number, and an elderly lady answered, and she had a deep southern accent. Oh, it was wonderful, but it was a bit difficult because she was hard of hearing. She couldn't understand a lot, and then she got a bit confused and upset. The phone went dead. That happened a few times. Anyhow, the phone didn't get answered for a week, and I thought, oh, no, I've blown it. So I started ringing the other sister. But again, she was very elderly, and it was hard for her. I said, is there anyone else I can speak to, please? So I phoned back whenever it was, a few hours later, and this other lady said, I don't know what you're ringing here for, this must be a joke. Paris is dead and he's not alive anymore, so don't ring and upset my mum. Anyway, that phone got put down again. Didn't go very well. So I was floundering a little, but I rang back the first address. I decided I'd leave a message on the answer phone. I said, my name is Monica, this is my telephone number. I'm calling from the UK. Paris was friendly with my family when he was over. If I could get in touch with anybody. It took a few days, but one day my phone at home rang. Again this voice, southern but younger, and she said, hi, I'm Judy. I'm Edna's daughter. You've been calling. We thought it was a joke at first. I decided to go for it at this point. I believe Paris Mac was my father. She said, your father? What do you mean? I said, well, you know he was a veteran in World War II and he was in England. I was born in 44. All my life I've been waiting for this moment. She said, oh my God, can this be real? I said, it's a lot for you to take in on a phone call. Can I write? I sat down and wrote this letter off to Judy, telling her all about myself. I was searching for my father. I sent a bunch of photographs. She phoned me back when she got those things. She said, oh my gosh, you're my cousin, you're my biological cousin, and you're English. She believed it straight away, and you'll see why in a minute when you see the pictures. If my health had been okay, she has heart problems, I would have tried to go and see his grave, just to stand there where he'd been buried. He was born in Mississippi, to go down to that place. I feel a deep connection to him. She sent me photographs of him and the family, and it was like all my birthdays and Christmases came at once. When I look at those photos, like all my birthdays and Christmases came at once when I looked at her photos. So her daughter walked in and she looked at it. This is a photo of Monica's dad that I'll show you in a minute. And she just burst into sobs. I said, what? Tell me. Oh my God, it's you, but in a male sort of face. Look, don't they look alike? I think that's so amazing. Monica feels it has transformed her life. I'm so joyful. I don't actually need anything. That's my dad. I know who I am. It just wipes out all the pain, all the emptiness and all the sadness. Full circle, just peace and joy. So the black GIs who come to Britain in the 1940s were initially received positively. Once they started to have relationships with local women, attitudes changed. As children were born of these relationships, hostility grew. The black GIs, the British mothers of these children, and the children themselves were frequently demonised. While more than half the mothers or grandmothers kept their children, the others were put in children's homes. When mothers were already married, the children were sometimes kept, with or without the husband still in tow, but in the majority of cases, the child was relinquished, the child seen as kind of an accident of the upheavals and excitement of war. Everyone was labelling the children a problem. But what was the nature of these children as a problem? Their illegitimacy, their non-whiteness, their being the sign of miscegenation, their viewed outsideness, their being thought not properly British, their lack of belonging. But of course, that lack of belonging was imposed on these children. The problem was the culture these children was entering. And the problem of belonging was made worse for the children through the exclusion of their fathers. Even where mothers kept their mixed-race children, the father was rarely thought of as part of their and their children's future. Years later, however, the children, now adults, often middle-aged, wanted desperately to find their fathers, the father they never knew. They embarked on a search that for some led to their fathers, or at least to their American relatives, half-siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts. What is so extraordinary is that such is the extensive use of DNA testing, particularly in the US at this time. People are still finding their American relatives, although of course their fathers are generally no longer alive because they would be well into their 90s. But people I've interviewed, I said, get your DNA testing done. I tell them about someone who's going to help them interpret it, and they are now finding these relatives. It's just amazing. Meeting their American fathers or relatives, or simply seeing photographs, has given them a sense of wholeness. Sandy Hughes, who had been placed in a children's home by her married mother, who rejected her all over again when she found the mother, says, I had no history of my own. I needed to know all this and understand it. Finding her father's American wife and hearing that her father, who unfortunately died, had always talked of her was a turning point. It was like, I was like tumbleweed. You know, when you see those cowboy films and the tumbleweeds just blowing about where the wind takes it. I was like that. And I was aware of it, but I didn't know how to change it. And it's about your roots to stabilise you. So I think Sandy's new sense of rootedness demonstrates clearly that the sense of belonging is not simply about where you grew up or live, but how you feel in the world, including of origin. But finding about fathers so late in life is a mixed, bittersweet blessing. To another of my interviewees, Elaine Brown, the whole experience has been, for her, a joyful heartache as well as a painful heartache. When you do find out about your father, you realise what you've missed. And as Monica expresses it, it's such a pity it took us until I was so old before I found out anything about Dad. Okay, thank you very much.